The worn ivory keys of the old upright piano felt like home under her fingers. They were yellowed with age, some slightly chipped, and they had a kind of warmth that the new, gleaming pianos at the conservatory lacked. In her small apartment, the sound of her playing would mix with the clatter of dishes from the kitchen and the muffled sound of the television from the living room. It was a messy, imperfect symphony of her life, and she loved it. This piano, a hand-me-down from a community center that was closing down, was where she had poured all her teenage years, all her unspoken dreams and frustrations. It was where she taught herself to feel the music, not just read the notes on the page. She never had a proper teacher, just a few old books and a deep, unshakable hunger to create something beautiful. Getting the scholarship to the Westwood Conservatory felt like stepping into a different world. It was a world of quiet hallways that smelled of lemon polish and old money, where students spoke in hushed tones about things she had only ever read in books galleries in Florence. Summer homes in the mountains, private lessons with world-famous musicians. They moved with an easy confidence she couldn't seem to fake. Their clothes were simple but expensive, their posture was perfect, and their hands, even when they weren't playing, seemed to rest elegantly, as if always ready. She, on the other hand, always felt like she was wearing a costume. Her one good blazer felt stiff and unnatural, and she was constantly worried about the scuffs on her shoes that had carried her miles on city sidewalks. Not just across polished marble floors, she was an outsider, and she knew it. The other students were polite, but there was a distance she couldn't cross. They would ask where she was from, and when she told them the name of her humble neighborhood, their eyes would glaze over with a polite confusion. They couldn't understand how someone from her world had ended up in theirs. She heard the whispers sometimes, not meant for her ears but carrying in the quiet practice rooms. The scholarship girl, they'd say, or the one with the raw talent. The phrase raw talent was the one that stung the most. It was a compliment, but it was also a label. It meant she was good but unrefined. A diamond in the rough, maybe, but still rough, the head of the piano department. A severe man with silver hair and eyes that seemed to look right through you was the worst. He would watch her during master classes, his expression unreadable, a slight frown creasing his forehead. When it was her turn to play, she would pour every ounce of her soul into the music, letting the notes tell the story she couldn't put into words. She would finish, her heart pounding in her chest, and the room would be silent. The other students would look at her, a mix of awe and pity in their eyes. Then the old professor would speak. His voice was always calm and measured, which somehow made his words cut deeper. Technically adequate, he might say, stroking his chin. But the interpretation is emotional, almost vulgar. We do not play Chopin as if it were a barroom brawl. We play it with grace, with restraint, with dignity. His words were like tiny, sharp needles pricking at her confidence. She wasn't playing it wrong, not in her heart. She was playing it with feeling, with the passion she believed the composer intended. But here, passion was seen as a flaw. Control was everything. They wanted to shape her, to sand down her rough edges until she fit into their neat, perfect mold. They wanted to take the fire out of her playing and replace it with a cool, distant light. She spent her days in a cycle of practice and self-doubt. She would find an empty practice room, close the door, and try to play like them. She would focus on her posture, on the precise curve of her fingers, on playing the notes exactly as written, without any of the extra flourishes or emotional swells that came naturally to her. But the music would feel dead under her hands. It was like trying to hold a bird in a cage. It might be safe, but it couldn't sing. Frustration would build inside her until she couldn't take it anymore. And she would let go, her fingers flying across the keys, playing with the wild, unrestrained joy that was her true voice. It was in those moments that she felt most like herself and most like a failure. The pressure was immense. The scholarship covered her tuition, but it didn't pay for her rent, for her food, for the new sheet music she was expected to buy. She worked evenings at a small cafe, her hands smelling of coffee and bleach when she came home to practice long after everyone else had gone to bed. She was tired all the time, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix. But she kept going, driven by a stubborn refusal to let them win. She had fought too hard to get here to give up now. Then came the announcement. The annual year-end showcase was a huge deal at Westwood. It was more than just a concert. It was an audition. The biggest music schools and agents from all over the country came to watch. A good performance could mean a full scholarship to a university, a recording contract, a career. A bad performance could mean the end of the road. For the other students, it was a chance to shine. For her, it was a chance to survive. As she read the notice on the bulletin board, a cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. This was it. The moment of truth. She had to prove she belonged, not just to them, but to herself. She had to show them that her raw talent was more than just a fluke, that her way of playing, her way of feeling the music had value. She walked away from the board, the chatter of the other students fading into the background, her mind already racing. She knew they would be watching her, waiting for her to fail. And for the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. She felt a spark of defiance. She wouldn't just play for them. She would play for every person who had ever been told they weren't good enough. She would play for the girl on the worn-out upright piano who dreamed of a stage like this. And she would not fail. The wait was the worst part. She sat on a hard wooden bench just outside the main faculty office, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. The door was thick and heavy, and she could only hear the muffled murmur of voices from within. Every now and then the door would open and another student would walk out. Some looked relieved, clutching a folder with their assigned piece. Others looked worried, their brows furrowed in concentration. They were the children of this world, and this was just another step for them. For her, it felt like she was waiting for a verdict. She watched them walk past, not really seeing them, lost in her own thoughts. She had been practicing harder than ever, trying to mold herself into what they wanted. She played their scales, their etudes, their proper interpretations. She felt like a chameleon, constantly changing colors to blend in, but terrified that at any moment her true, garish self would show through. She just needed a fair chance. A piece of music that would let her show them she could be disciplined, that she could be graceful. A piece that wasn't too flashy, but had enough heart to let her true self peek through just a little. Finally, a sharp voice called her name from the doorway. It was the head professor's assistant, a young woman with a pinched face who never smiled. "They're ready for you now." She stood up, her legs feeling shaky. The hallway suddenly seemed very long. She took a deep breath and walked into the room. It was exactly as she had imagined, a long, polished mahogany table that could have seated 20 people. At the far end sat the panel of professors, a row of serious faces under the dim, scholarly light of a chandelier. But her eyes were drawn to the man in the center, the old professor with the silver hair and the eyes that missed nothing. He didn't look up at first, just made a slow, deliberate note on a piece of paper in front of him. The silence in the room was heavy, pressing down on her. "Ah, yes," he said, his voice finally cutting through the quiet. He still didn't look at her, but slid a single sheet of music across the vast, polished surface of the table. It stopped just short of the edge. "We have given special consideration to your unique case. We believe this piece will be a technical challenge worthy of your potential." Her heart was thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. She walked slowly to the table, her footsteps echoing in the silent room. She reached out and picked up the paper. It was heavier than the cheap paper she was used to, a crisp, expensive stock. Her eyes scanned the page, and at first she didn't understand. It looked like a mistake, a printing error. The notes were packed so tightly together they looked like a swarm of black insects. There were more sharps and flats and strange symbols than she had ever seen in one place. Her eyes traveled to the top of the page, searching for a composer's name she might recognize, and then she saw it. Franz Liszt, and beneath it the title * La Campanella. * A cold dread washed over her, so sudden and so sharp that it almost made her gasp out loud. She knew that name. Every piano student, even a self-taught one from a dusty neighborhood, knew that name. It was a legend, a ghost story that music teachers would tell their students to make them practice their scales. It was famous not just for being difficult, but for being impossible. It was a piece designed for a pianist with 3 hands and fingers made of lightning. She had once watched a video of a world-famous pianist playing it, and she remembered thinking it looked like a magic trick, something no human should be able to do. She looked up from the page, her eyes meeting the old professor's for the first time. He was watching her now, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his thin lips. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a cat that has just cornered a mouse. He saw the flicker of recognition and horror in her eyes, and the smile widened just a fraction. He knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't a chance. This was a public execution. The other professors sat silent, their faces blank. They were all part of it. This was their way of getting rid of her, the raw talent, the outsider who didn't fit. They couldn't expel her for not being good enough, not after she had won the scholarship on merit, but they could make her fail. So spectacularly, so publicly, that she would have no choice but to leave in shame. They could set a trap, and she had just walked right into it. Her mind raced. The piece was known for its terrifyingly fast jumps, where the right hand had to leap back and forth over huge distances in a fraction of a second. It required a lightness, a delicacy in the left hand to play the Little Bell theme, while the right hand was doing Olympic-level gymnastics. It was a piece of pure, unadulterated showmanship, designed for a performer with absolute technical perfection and a lifetime of training. She had a worn-out piano and a fire in her belly. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. She could already picture the night of the showcase. She would walk out on stage, the weight of their expectations crushing her. She would sit at the huge, gleaming concert piano and begin to play. And within the first 10 seconds, everyone would know. Her fingers would fumble the first jump. The delicate bell theme would sound clumsy and heavy. The audience would shift uncomfortably in their seats. Her fellow students would watch with a mixture of pity and relief. And the professors, sitting in the front row, would watch with their cold, satisfied eyes. She wouldn't just be failing a test. She would be proving them right. She would be confirming that she was nothing more than a rough, undisciplined girl who had stumbled into a place she didn't belong. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, the single sheet of music feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. She wanted to scream, to cry, to tear the paper into 1,000 pieces and throw it in their smug faces, but she didn't. She did the only thing she could do. She straightened her back, looked the old professor directly in the eye, and gave a small, stiff nod. "Thank you, sir," she said. Her voice surprisingly steady. She turned and walked out of the room, her back ramrod straight, refusing to let them see her crumble. The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind her, the strength left her legs. She leaned against the cool wall of the hallway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The pristine, silent halls of the conservatory no longer felt like a place of learning. They felt like a beautiful, gilded cage, and they had just handed her the key to her own cell. Clutched in her hand was not a piece of music, but a sentence. And she had less than a month to find a way to appeal it. For the first few days, she attacked the music like it was a personal enemy. The practice rooms at the conservatory became her prison. She would lock the door, the sound of the latch echoing in the sterile silence, and sit down at the gleaming grand piano. The sheet music for La Campanella felt like a list of accusations. Every black dot on the page was a challenge, a sneer at her lack of formal training. She decided the only way to win was through sheer force. Through repetition, through wearing the song down until it surrendered, her days became a blur of pain and frustration. She would wake up with her fingers already stiff and sore. At the cafe, her hands would tremble slightly as she poured coffee, the muscles aching from the night before. She would come back to the conservatory, her mind clouded with exhaustion, and try again. She would isolate the most difficult passages, the terrifying leaps where her right hand had to jump more than an octave in a fraction of a second, and play them over and over. Hundreds of times. 1,000 times. The notes would come out as a jumbled mess, a thud of wrong keys. She would curse under her breath, shake out her hands, and start again. She was trying to build a wall of muscle memory, brick by painful brick. But the wall kept collapsing. The other students didn't seem to have this problem. Through the thin walls of the practice rooms, she could hear them. Their music would flow, elegant and trolled. They were playing their assigned pieces, challenging but manageable works by Brahms or Debussy. They sounded like they were having conversations with the composers. She sounded like she was having a fist fight. The contrast was crushing. They were honing their craft. She was just trying to survive. She felt like a fraud, a wild animal who had been brought into a palace and was now expected to perform delicate tricks. The more she tried to be like them, to be precise and controlled, the more her music rebelled. The fire that was her greatest asset now felt like a flaw she had to hide. One night, around 2 a.m, she broke. She had been practicing for 6 hours straight, fueled by nothing but stale coffee and sheer stubbornness. The practice room was cold, and the only light was a single lamp casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. She was attempting the main theme, the part with the delicate little bell notes that have to ring out clearly while the other hand is doing something impossibly complicated. For the 10th time in a row, her fingers fumbled. The sound that came out wasn't a bell. It was a clatter like a handful of silverware dropped on a stone floor. That was it. The last thread of her resolve snapped. She slammed her hands down on the keys, creating a loud, discordant crash that echoed through the empty building. She didn't care if anyone heard. She leaned forward, her forehead resting on the cool wood of the piano, and a sob escaped her throat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated defeat. She couldn't do it. They were right. She wasn't good enough. She was raw, undisciplined, and completely out of her depth. The thought of quitting, of just walking away and never touching a piano again, wasn't a sad thought anymore. It was a relief. A peaceful, easy way out. She sat there in the silence, the tears drying on her cheeks, and seriously considered it, but then something strange happened. As she sat there, defeated, she wasn't hearing her own clumsy attempts at the song. She was hearing it in her head as it was meant to be played. She could hear the clear, sparkling sound of the little bell, not as a technical challenge, but as a playful, teasing melody. She could hear the fast runs not as a series of notes to be conquered, but as a burst of pure, joyful energy. It was like she was remembering a song she used to know a long time ago. On a whim, she pulled out her phone. She ignored the modern recordings of the piece, the ones played by flawless virtuosos with perfect technique. Those videos always felt intimidating, like they were showing her how impossible her task was. Instead, she started reading about the composer, Liszt. She learned that he wasn't just some stuffy old composer from a book. In his time, he was a rock star. He was a rebel. He was known for his wild, emotional performances, for playing with a passion that sometimes shocked the classical music world. He wasn't just a technician. He was a showman, an artist who broke all the rules. A tiny spark of an idea began to flicker in the back of her mind. She had been trying to play the song the way the old professor wanted her to, with precision, with control, with cold, perfect technique. But that wasn't the spirit of the song at all. The song was a rebellion. It was a celebration of wild, untamable energy. They had given her this piece to expose her technical weaknesses, but what if she didn't play it as a technical exercise? What if she played it as a story? She went back to the piano, but this time her approach was completely different. She didn't think about the impossible jumps or the finger-twisting passages. She thought about the story. She closed her eyes and imagined the little bell, ringing out, clear and bright, daring the rest of the music to try and drown it out. She started to play that part, not with the rigid precision she'd been taught, but with a light, almost mischievous touch. And to her surprise, it was easier. Her fingers, instead of being stiff with fear, were relaxed and playful. Then she moved to the fast, difficult sections. She didn't try to nail every single note. Instead, she tried to capture the feeling of a whirlwind, of a dancer spinning out of control. She let her body move with the music, a slight sway, a bounce in her shoulders. She was no longer fighting the piano. She was dancing with it. The mistakes were still there, but they didn't matter anymore. They were part of the dance. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about what the professors would say. She wasn't thinking about the other students. She was just playing. She was telling a story of defiance and joy, a story that felt more like her own story than anything she had ever played before. She didn't master the song that night, not even close. But as the first light of dawn began to filter through the window, she played through one of the most difficult passages. And it came out not perfectly, but beautifully. It was alive. It had a fire and a spirit that no amount of sterile practice could ever create. She stopped, a slow smile spreading across her face. They had given her an impossible task to expose her weakness. But she had just discovered that her greatest weakness was also her greatest strength. They had given her a mountain to climb, and she had just realized she didn't have to follow their path. She could fly. The night of the showcase arrived with a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. Inside the grand concert hall, the atmosphere was thick with a mixture of excitement and formality. It was a sea of velvet seats and polished wood, with a massive crystal chandelier hanging overhead like a captured galaxy. The air buzzed with the quiet murmur of wealthy patrons, proud parents, and important-looking guests, all dressed in their finest clothes. They were there to see a polished, predictable display of talent from the conservatory's best students. They had no idea they were about to witness a rebellion. Backstage, the world was a chaos of nerves and rushing bodies. Students in elegant black and white attire paced in narrow hallways, whispering last-minute encouragement to each other. But she felt strangely calm, separate from the nervous energy around her. She sat on a simple wooden chair, her sheet music closed on her lap. She wasn't looking at it anymore. The notes were inside her now, not just in her fingers, but in her bones. She had spent the last few weeks not just practicing, but living with the music. She had poured all her anger, her frustration, her loneliness, and her defiant hope into every single phrase. The song was no longer Liszt's. It was hers. A stagehand in a black t-shirt peeked his head around the corner. "You're on after the next one," he said, his voice a low whisper. She nodded and stood up, smoothing down the simple black dress she had bought at a thrift store. It was plain, but it was clean, and it felt like her. As she walked toward the side of the stage, she could hear the current performer playing a Mozart sonata. It was beautiful, flawless, and perfect. It was everything the conservatory valued, precise, elegant, and controlled. It was the kind of performance that would have earned a respectful, polite applause. Then her name was called. She walked out onto the stage. The sudden brightness of the lights was blinding, and for a moment she couldn't see the audience. Just a vast, dark space filled with invisible faces. The walk to the grand piano in the center of the stage felt longer than any road she had ever traveled. She could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes on her. She saw the front row, a line of severe, familiar faces. The other professors looked on with their usual blank expressions, but her eyes found the head professor. He was watching her with a cool, detached curiosity, like a scientist observing an experiment. He expected a disaster. He was waiting for it, but she wasn't there for his approval anymore. She reached the piano and sat down on the bench. It was smooth and cold, a world away from the worn wood of her old upright. She ran her fingers over the keys, a silent greeting. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, blocking out the hall, the people, the expectations. In that darkness, there was only her and the music. She took a deep breath, and when she opened her eyes, there was a new fire in them. She began to play. The first notes were the Little Bell theme. They didn't crash or clang. They rang out, clear and delicate, like tiny silver bells hanging in a silent, empty space. It was a sound that was so pure and unexpected that a hush fell over the entire hall. It wasn't just technically correct. It was filled with a teasing, almost playful spirit. It was a dare, then the storm began. Her right hand flew across the keyboard, navigating the terrifyingly fast jumps that had haunted her for weeks. But now they weren't just jumps. They were leaps of defiance. Each time her hand flew through the air to land on a distant note, it was an act of rebellion. The sound that came out was not a frantic scramble, but a cascade of brilliant, shimmering notes like a waterfall of stars. She wasn't just hitting the right keys. She was telling a story of a wild spirit that refused to be tamed. Her body moved with the music. A gentle sway, a slight lean into the piano. She was no longer the stiff, awkward girl trying to fit in. She was completely lost in the world she was creating. The music swelled, rising and falling like a living thing. There were moments of breathtaking speed where her fingers were a blur of motion, a whirlwind of sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very foundations of the hall. Then there were moments of quiet intimacy, where the music would soften to a whisper, pulling the audience in close, making them lean forward in their seats to catch every delicate note. She wasn't thinking about the professors. She wasn't thinking about the technical difficulty. She was playing with a passion that was raw and real and utterly captivating. It was the sound of her journey, of every late-night practice, every moment of doubt, and every spark of hope. It was the sound of the girl from the small apartment with the worn-out piano, finally letting her voice be heard. In the front row, the head professor's expression had changed. The detached curiosity was gone, replaced by a look of utter shock. His eyes were wide, his lips slightly parted. He had expected a train wreck, a mess of wrong notes and clumsy fumbling. He was hearing something else entirely. He was hearing the piece played not as a technical exercise, but as it was truly meant to be played, with a fiery, untamable soul. He was hearing the rebellion he had tried so hard to stamp out of her. The final passage of the piece was a furious, breathtaking sprint to the finish line. Her hands flew across the keyboard in a dazzling display of power and precision, a final, triumphant declaration. And then, with one last, powerful chord, it was over. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, profound silence that hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the entire audience was under a spell, still trapped in the world she had created for them. She sat at the piano, her chest heaving, her hands resting on the keys, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. Then, a single person in the back row stood up and began to clap. It was a loud, sharp sound that broke the spell. Then another person joined in, and another. Suddenly, the entire hall erupted. It wasn't the polite, reserved applause the conservatory was used to. It was a roar, a thunderous, deafening wave of sound that shook the room. People were on their feet, cheering, whistling, shouting, "Brava!" Her fellow students, the ones who had whispered about her, were on their feet, their faces filled with awe and disbelief. She had not just played the song. She had conquered it, and in doing so, she had conquered them all. She looked out at the standing ovation, her eyes searching the front row. The head professor was still seated, but he was staring at her, his face a mask of stunned, grudging respect. She had passed his test. But more importantly, she had passed her own. The sound hit her like a physical wave, a warm, roaring force that seemed to lift her right off the piano bench. For a moment, the world was a blur of light and noise. The faces in the audience were indistinct, just a sea of open mouths and clapping hands. She could see people standing, their bodies silhouetted against the bright stage lights, but her mind couldn't quite process it. It was like watching a movie of someone else's life. Her heart was a drum against her ribs, not with fear, but with a strange, overwhelming sense of wonder. She had done it. She had actually done it. She slowly stood up, her legs feeling shaky and weak. She turned to face the crowd and gave a small, awkward bow. It wasn't a graceful, practiced bow of the other students. It was a genuine, clumsy movement from a girl who was completely overwhelmed. The applause only grew louder. She turned and walked off the stage, her footsteps unsteady. The moment she was in the wings, out of the blinding lights, the world came rushing back in. A stagehand gave her a thumbs up and a wide, genuine smile. Backstage, a few of the other students, the ones who had already performed, were staring at her with their mouths open. One of them, a girl who played the cello and had always ignored her, simply said, "Wow." It was one word, but it held more weight than any standing ovation. She didn't go back to the reception area. She couldn't face all those people, all those questions and congratulations. She needed to be alone. She slipped out a side door and into the cool night air. The city was alive with sounds, the distant wail of a siren, the hum of traffic, but all she could hear was the echo of the applause in her ears. She leaned against the cold brick wall of the building and took a deep, shuddering breath. She felt a tear slide down her cheek, and this time it wasn't a tear of frustration or defeat. It was a tear of release. It was the letting go of months of doubt, of feeling like an imposter, of believing that she wasn't good enough. In that moment, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had walked into that hall with something to prove, not just to them, but to herself. And she had done it. The next day at the conservatory was different. The change was in the air, subtle but undeniable. As she walked down the hallway, people didn't just look away politely. They met her eyes. They smiled. Some of them nodded. In the cafeteria, a group of students from the WIN section waved her over to their table. She hesitated, expecting the usual polite distance, but they were insistent. "That was incredible last night," one of them said, his eyes wide with excitement. "I've never heard anyone play like that. You made it sound alive." She sat with them, feeling a little awkward at first, but they treated her like an equal, like an artist they admired. They didn't ask about her technique or her training. They asked about the music, about how she felt when she played it. For the first time, they weren't interested in where she came from. They were interested in who she was. The biggest change, however, was yet to come. 2 days after the showcase, she received a note. It was a request to meet with the head of the piano department. The old, familiar dread returned, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. She walked to his office with the same fear she had felt the day he had given her the impossible piece. She was sure he was going to find some way to take it all away, to tell her that her performance was emotional and undisciplined. A fluke that shouldn't be encouraged. She knocked on the heavy door and entered his office. It was just as she remembered, dark wood, shelves of dusty books, and the faint smell of old paper and polish. He was sitting behind his large desk, but he didn't have his usual stern, unreadable expression. He looked tired. And something else, thoughtful. He didn't invite her to sit. He just looked at her for a long moment, the silence stretching out between them. "Your performance of the list," he said finally, his voice quiet. "It was unconventional." She braced herself for the criticism. "You took liberties with the tempo. Your interpretation was, in many places, a complete departure from the traditional score." He paused, steepling his fingers under his chin. "It was also the most compelling performance of that piece I have heard in 30 years. Her mouth fell open. She had expected anything but this. "I have spent my career teaching students how to control the music," he continued, his gaze distant, as if he was looking into the past. "How to perfect it, to polish it until it is flawless. I believe that was the highest form of art. I gave you that piece because I wanted to show you the limits of your passion. I wanted to prove to you that without discipline, without control, raw talent is nothing." He looked directly at her then, and for the first time she saw not a cold, judgmental man, but a teacher who was questioning his own beliefs. "I was wrong. You didn't just play the notes. You understood the spirit of the piece in a way I have never seen. You didn't control the music. You let it live." He stood up and walked over to a window, looking out at the campus grounds. "We have a masterclass series next semester. A series of guest lectures from some of the most respected pianists in the world. I would like you to open the first one. Not as a student, as an artist. I want you to play for them, and then I want you to talk to them. Not about technique, not about discipline. I want you to talk to them about what it means to find your own voice." She was speechless. This was more than an apology. It was an offering. It was an invitation to not just belong, but to lead. It was the ultimate validation of everything she had fought for. She left his office in a daze, the weight of his words slowly sinking in. She walked past the practice rooms, the sounds of pianos and violins drifting through the doors. She found an empty room and sat down at the piano. She didn't play La Campanella. She didn't play anything complicated. She just played a simple melody, one that she had made up a long time ago on her old upright piano at home. She played it softly, her fingers moving with a new confidence and ease. The music that came out was not a fistfight anymore. It was a clear, steady, and beautiful voice. It was her voice. And for the first time, she knew, without a doubt, that it was a voice that deserved to be heard.